What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Mist Podcast. I am your host, Arrow Mist. What's poppin'? So today we're gonna go over communication. Communication is probably one of the, just like emotional intelligence, one of the most broken things that we have in today's modern society. Because communication is the entire foundation of how we attempt to not only understand each other, which obviously is extremely important, but articulating our ideas to one another, which is probably the most important part about effective communication, because without idealizing something appropriately and then expressing that, the expression itself is what gets lost in its own translation. And that means that any type of good idea is still only as good as its articulation. And so if you can't explain something well, then it doesn't really matter how good your idea is or ever will be. Now, when we look at all walks of life specifically that you could exist that involve communication, relationships, connecting with people, and I'm not just like talking about love relationships like your friends, your family, like whoever it might be or whatever it is, you're only going to be able to have things as effective as you can feel them and as well as you can communicate them. And like emotional intelligence takes into a part of communicating your emotions accurately. And I think a part of this will end up stemming into like the aspect of how educated people are, because you can't communicate any better than what you're educated to communicate as. But at the same time, if you don't know the depths of, you don't know what emotions are and how they work and how they function, then how exactly can someone be accurate in representing their side of their emotions if whenever they're going to be speaking those emotions, they don't know how to talk about it? I think this is a part of the lack of emotional intelligence, but I mean, that can be said for just about anything. You know, someone has a great idea on like a business they want to start for themselves, or improving a piece of tech, or doing anything that involves around imposing what's in here down then through the mouth, what's in your brain through however and whoever you're trying to project this energy towards. And communication is also just a projection of energy. And it's important to remember that sometimes even if you communicate effectively, that doesn't mean you're going to be received. And I think that's part of the effective communication aspect, is that both sides of this coin lie on the same bed, meaning that no matter what you do, you have to establish that even if you are able to communicate effectively, are you able to be interpreted? And maybe this kind of, it's like the double-edged part of it, like, well, if I'm having trouble being received, then is my communication actually effective? Like, am I really communicating appropriately? And you could be. You very well could be. But it then depends on like what effort you're trying to put to make sure that you are understood. Because there is a definitive line on just like, I don't know how to get this across for people to understand it and whatever else. But then there's also the other tie-in of like, well, I understand this and I know that like I understand it thoroughly in my head, and then I can articulate that out, but is someone going to be able to like hear me out? And, you know, because the energy in itself is a very distorted plane sometimes. And communication is a very lost sense of, you know, the antenna, essentially. Every person is an antenna, and it's not just the words. When you're speaking with someone, that's not just the only part of the communication. The other part of the communication is like your articulation, of course, but how the other is receiving it, how the other party is in taking whatever it is that, you know, you're proposing. And it's good to know like when that's a part of you not communicating effectively and when you are communicating effectively, but there's an entirely different reason as to why, you know, you're not being received, heard. And you know, I think this is just kind of down into like communication is also its guided intention. Your words will only be as hearable as the guide that the energy is being pushed of that by. Okay, that seemed a little confusing saying that out loud. But when you speak, you're pushing energy forward. And when you push that forward, what intention you bring behind that energy is going to be then how it's perceived. And the translation of you not being picked up by someone can sometimes be that they're not able to handle the energetic point of that, of the strength of your intention, essentially, right? But then again, this kind of goes on like, if you know you're avid at being able to communicate effectively, maybe you should reevaluate if that's true. But on top of that, there's so many ways to communicate one idea that maybe you have to go through all of those. We have to take all these things into account because we have to understand, like, if we're wondering why our communication isn't as effective, why exactly is that? And how many compartments to this communication are becoming a hindrance or becoming a progression into how I'm going to make sure that I get it across when I want it to be getting across effectively. And in my own personal stance, there have definitely been times where I realized I could have communicated effectively, or I could have communicated more effectively. But even in the same motion of understanding that communication, I also understand like when, where, how, why, or if I was ever heard. So I think going over this is just understanding the trail of information and making sure that we have that so we know what communication really is supposed to be about whenever it's flowing out of us, going through another person's biosphere and, you know, their bubble, and then if they're taking it in, how they're taking it in, and, you know, what's going on, and if the translation mattered or not. Because sometimes you can explain something to someone and, you know, it might not exactly get through on them understanding it. Like they might, okay, I kind of know what you're talking about, like, but they don't understand it entirely. And one way that you can establish this better is like metaphors, basically changing the prospect of how you approach your communication can be extremely important. If it matters that much to make sure that whoever is on the receiving end of whatever you're giving, they're able to comprehend it. I try my best to, when I personally do this and I'm communicating and I understand like that not always is the communication itself, like I just don't ever put myself in a position like energetically that I'm going to be spoken in a point that is not received, because I don't, as some people in their own mind could have, do not want to waste my breath. I'm not going to waste my energy. My energy will always be well spent, every aspect and way that I spend it, especially in a communication form. So if I'm even going to take the initial effort to reform the communication in a way that's going to let somebody perceive it other than how I would have presented it, would also only be because it helps me grow and learn how to take something, condense it more, and make it more practical to articulate that. And sometimes the best things that are able to be understood, especially from a communication point, is not overcomplicating it with too much information, but simplifying it enough effectively to still be able to give what has to be comprehended. And for me personally, I know everyone's own journey is a little bit different when it comes to this, but for me personally, when it comes to communicating, I've never had a problem with it. The only problem I ever had with communicating, because you should always be attempting to communicate, and communicating and trying to get your words out and say something is going to help you continue to find out how to articulate it in words, right? The words themselves are a practice, and if you don't practice how you're going to get those words out, and then that it's just not going to work. If you're going to, and as a musician, this is why it's a little different for me, is my voice has always been my instrument. And so that's why a part of this has been an ingrained aspect of how I've learned to communicate, is also the experience of, you know, fucking up with communication, and also then knowing how I'm receiving what I get on the other end and how it affects me emotionally and what other things I'm taking into account when it comes to looking at communication in general. So one thing I can say, if you want to communicate better, is practice it. All of these things in the idea, not an idea, but in the aspect of it being an idea in your head of how you would communicate and help yourself communicate better, and whatever else is nothing until you have attributed it to experience, to going on some social aspect, some social platform, VR chat, going on Instagram and DMing people, like whatever you're going to do to be social. Unless you go and attempt to do that and just start building your repertoire of communicating, then you're not going to be able to get a grasp on how you're going to effectively know how to communicate. Because when you are communicating it in maybe the most important of times to somebody in a very crucial and intense moment, you could then be trying to figure out how the communication even works. And that's probably the worst time for you to be attempting to learn how to do it. Now, I mean, doing and learning things under pressure is never a bad thing. That's actually a really, really good thing if you can learn from that. But a lot of times the pressure is what creates this freeze motion and doesn't even let you learn, let alone give you the opportunity to like figure it out on the spot. That's why, some get froze whenever it comes to attempting to communicate and bring their ideas out, and however you're going to do that. And so what I always say is that even if like it seems like it's nonsense or whatever else, go into social places on the internet and go practice your communication. And you will be able to take that in your IRL experiences and your in-person experiences, because you'll already have practiced what to say. It's just like now you're getting accustomed to the in-person dynamic realistically, and that's all that is. And once you have that down, then your communication becomes more and more seamless the more that you practice it, and then this helps you connect with other people. And the basis of this overall is letting you know that getting deeper into letting yourself communicate and getting better at your communication is going to give you the opportunity to really figure things out in every area, even having friends and connecting with people and, building your soul tribe and keeping those people around you that are going to be with you forever, or getting rid of the people that aren't, right? Like you just have to build your voice. You have to build the spirit's voice. You have to spend the time learning how that works and what you're supposed to do with it. Otherwise, it's not really going to work like that. And with music, it's the same way. Like I can think in my head how I want to do something, but I stopped pre-writing. I just completely stopped trying to do it before I got in front of the mic, because I don't even know what all I'm going to want to do with it until I know how it sounds out of my mouth. Like, that's when I'm going to put it together. And even if I have somewhat of an idea before I walk in or before I'm going to start recording, which I usually do, like I at least have an idea, but I have to bring that idea to life every time I am creating. And in creation, it's still just going to happen. Like your thoughts are a part of the creation, and that's where articulation comes into your communication, and garnishing the realm of your effective communication and progressing with it is imperative to your survival even. Because if you don't get this thing down, how could we communicate to do things globally if we didn't have the capability of breaking language barriers and being able to have everyone underneath one communication line, even if it is either one specific language, which English has become the most prominent thing that most things happen in, or translators and people that can translate between two different places. But I mean, why do we need that when we have the technology that can accelerate and, take all of that to the next level, essentially? So overall, it's just important to keep in mind and continue to keep in mind how important that communication is and how important it will forever be. So it's something you have to practice, and it's something that if you can get better with it, that it becomes easier to do. It becomes easier to tell people your ideas. It becomes easier for you to understand what you want to put forth and what you're taking in, because you also have a better time than understanding other people, because you can kind of get how they're like, if they're saying something without directly saying it, right? And then you can relay and re-ask that question to confirm that. And like, it gives you an easier time connecting with people because you get to understand them. And, doing that is sometimes a choice, but everyone is different, and it always depends. But anyway, practice your communication and you will get better. Thank you guys so much for listening, for hanging out, for checking things out. you can check everything else out I got going in the description. Arrowmist.xyz. We sell Rapstone pendants. I got merch for my music. I make music. Got all that cool stuff going on. We are doing a weekly release on the podcast, so make sure you guys are tuning back in every week if you want to see another episode. If you have any suggestions, you want to ask a spiritual question, something that's related to some of the things that I've already done, or you have anything you want to put to the conversation, throw it in my DMs. Let's have a talk. And if it's good enough, we might even bring the talk on here and have a part 2 to some of these discussions. So thank you guys so much, and I will catch you in the next one.